I spent last summer backpacking and hitchhiking from Knoxville to New York. Having just finished my sociology degree, I figured I'd do something bucket listy before starting my new job in early September. I always loved spontaneous travel, to just go where the wind takes me. And that summer was the first time I had the money to do so with some comfort. I could stay at the occasional motel, hop on a train, or just take a cab every now and then. I had options, and I wanted this to be a final, youthful adventure before I got stuck in the rat race. I made my way up through Kingston, Princeton, and Beckley, heading northeast. I hitchhiked most of the way, but I sometimes had to walk for hours before someone pulled over to give me a ride. I even had a cardboard sign saying, "New York, New York." But man, it gets rough out there. Nothing to protect you from the sudden rain. And there's no guarantee you'll find a place to stay before it gets dark. And you don't want to fall asleep when you're getting a ride from someone. Safety first. By the time I got to the small town of Juniper, West Virginia, I was exhausted. I stopped at a cafe to get some directions and a bite to eat. Got myself a smiling little blue sunflower pin. Some kind of local charity thing. What can I say? The thing was next to a wanted poster of two kids. I felt bad. As I didn't know a lot of the people in the area, and I'd been walking for the better part of 2 days, I decided to catch a Greyhound going north. Not too far, just enough to get me to Morgantown. I knew some people there and figured a shower and a warm home-cooked meal would turn my frown upside down. I asked the cashier for directions. "Buses don't stop in Juniper," she said. "We don't get those." Strange. I stuck around for a couple of hours before I got back on the road. No one was looking twice at my cardboard plea, so I just had to keep going on my own. By that time, I had learned exactly one thing about Juniper: that buses don't stop there. And I was about to learn a second thing: that the roads are concrete garbage. I'd been walking for about 2 hours. It was getting dark. I was following the main road out of town when a piece of concrete got loose, causing me to slip and twist my ankle. I fell over by the roadside, clutching my foot, and already seeing some bruising. Now there was really no other option but to get a bus. I backtracked to a culvert down the road and found myself a piece of rebar I could use as a walking stick. As the streetlights turned on, I was pissed. I thought about calling for a cab, but I was in the middle of nowhere and I didn't know how to describe it. I get anxious on the phone. Finally, just around a bend, I could see a bus stop. Just this little sign by the side of the road. Not even a bench or anything. But there was a guy waiting there, so I figured I was on the right track. I hobbled up there and plopped down at the side of the road. I tried to bandage my ankle and give it some support, but I'd have a hard time walking for the next few days either way. There was no getting away from that. All the while, this other guy kept staring at me. I had no idea what kind of bus went through there, but I figured if someone else was waiting for one, it couldn't be too far out of line. But judging from the way the other guy looked at me, something was off. At first look, there wasn't anything inherently strange about him. Just some guy in his early 40s. Dirty jeans, rolled up flannel shirt, and a gray baseball cap. The only thing that kind of stood out was his scarf. It was this yellow pastel fleece type scarf which covered most of his neck. It looked a bit out of place, but not so much that I initially even thought about it. But the guy kept staring at me. There was something off about the way he looked at me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "Excuse me," I said. "Do you know when the next bus gets here?" No response. No acknowledgement of any kind. No nods or head shakes. Excuse me, sir?" I repeated. "Is there a bus coming?" Still nothing. I shrugged it off. Maybe he didn't speak English. But even then, he ought to have said something. I waited for the better part of an hour. The sky grew dark, and I was slowly coming to terms with having to sleep outside for the night, if need be. I had a tent. I'd be fine. Still, the creepy guy was just standing there, staring at me. He wasn't even checking his phone or anything. He just kept looking my way, pacing back and forth. I tried to put into words exactly what bothered me about him. The first thing I noticed was his eyes. They didn't seem to blink in unison. He would close one eye, open it, and then close the next one. It wouldn't be a pattern, it was seemingly random, but quick. You wouldn't catch it at first glance. Secondly, there was his chest. When he stood still, I could see him take very shallow breaths. There was this faint noise coming from his nose, like micro whistles. At one point, there hadn't been a single car passing by for 15 minutes. Suddenly, the strange man walked up to me. He looked at me with those wild, random eyes. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Do you..." Before I could finish my sentence, he grasped the bus stop sign and tipped it over. He barely made an effort. An uncomfortable thought washed over me. Maybe he put that sign up in the first place. I took out my phone, as if to show him that I was ready to call for help, if need be. I got up on my feet, leaning against the rebar crutch. "There's no bus coming, is there?" I asked. There was no response. Instead, he stopped pacing. Not just stopped as in stopped moving, but as in stopping so completely that it looked like he wasn't even breathing. The only thing moving was the size of his pupils, slowly growing wider, like a cat ready to pounce. Something in the back of my mind screamed at me to run, but my ankle wouldn't let me. I got about 3 steps down the road before he tackled me, sending us both reeling down a 15-foot slope. All the while, he kept taking these shallow breaths, like an excited dog. I found myself face first in the dirt, with this stranger's body next to me. A dense pine forest stretching out for miles ahead. My head was spinning, trying to figure out what was even happening. As I scrambled to get back on my feet, I couldn't stop focusing on this one stupid detail. That his body was incredibly light. It was like getting tackled by a water balloon. By the time I got up, my attacker was ready to pounce again. Somewhere down the slope, I must have dropped my phone. As he lurched forward, I swung my piece of rebar in a wide arc, smacking him on the side of the head. It was like hitting a sandbag. It didn't even slow him down. Before I could build up the momentum to swing again, he grabbed me. It surprised me, making me trip over my own feet as he pulled me into the woods. He had this grip like a goddamn vice that just dug into my clothes, and he was much stronger than I anticipated. I was dragged along by my backpack. I managed to get it off and escape his grip for a moment, but before I could get away, those hands got me by the neck of my jacket. No matter how much I kicked and screamed, I could see the lights by the road disappearing further and further away. I got dragged through bushes, saplings, and branches. Things were poking into my skin, tearing at my clothes. I could barely breathe, but I kept struggling. The man in the yellow scarf just kept pulling me further away from the light, all the while panting with rapid breaths. It didn't matter how much I screamed, squirmed, or twisted. Those hands weren't letting up. We battled for what felt like hours. I got out of my jacket, and he grabbed me by the foot. I got my shoes off, but he just grabbed my belt. After a while, I was too tired to fight. I resigned myself to just holding on to whatever I could reach to try to slow him down, but all it did was bruise my hands. At some point, I just laid there, exhausted, as he dragged me further into the woods. The rough forest floor turned to soft grass as I was pulled into a field. The full moon was out, and I could see all the way through the clearing. The man in the yellow scarf suddenly stopped and inhaled a deep breath, his torso swelling up like a balloon. There was a faint crackle as his ribs readjusted. He was smelling something. I made an attempt to get up, but he just kicked me back down and put a foot on my torso. At the slightest movement, he would press down to keep me in check. There were others there. I could hear them shuffling through the tall grass. From where I lay, I could only see the top half of them. There were 3 of them in total, 2 men and a woman. 2 of them were carrying their own bus signs. All 3 of them were wearing scarves, similar to that of my assailant. One of the men hissed. Actually hissed with his mouth wide open. He made this threatening stance and stepped forward, but my attacker didn't flinch. Instead, he hissed back. It wasn't a normal sound. It was like someone desperately trying to cough, but never quite getting the phlegm out. I felt like prey to a predator, as they non-verbally argued about who gets to do something. Someone grabbed me by the neck. A fourth one, still wielding a bus stop sign. I was pulled away, and as my attacker flinched, they pounced on him. It escalated into a full-on brawl, but not like any fight I'd ever seen. They were contorting their bodies at impossible angles, their torsos swelling and shrinking like blowfish. They kept thrusting their necks forward while their heads just bobbed back and forth. In the confusion, I started crawling. No one was looking at me. I crawled on my belly, trying to get away. My ankle was killing me. Every little bump sent a jolt of pain all the way up my leg through my spine. Then, suddenly, they stopped. At the edge of the forest clearing, I could see yet another one. This one was much larger. A woman, easily 6'8". She was carrying a bus stop sign. This one of a slightly different model. And she had someone thrown over her shoulder. Another victim. Before I could react, hands grabbed me. My arms, my legs, my clothes, and they started to drag me through the clearing. Whatever disagreements they'd had must have been cleared up by the presence of this leader character. Out of reflex, I tried to talk. I demanded that they listen to me, that they explain themselves. Anything. I could hear my voice breaking as I got nothing but vacant expressions in return. These dumb, rolling eyes. All of them blinking at random. All of them taking shallow breaths. But this last one, the large one, she was something different entirely. She moved like her joints didn't matter. She bent her arms back and forth, and she kept swiveling her head like an owl. Her mouth was wide open, like she was constantly screaming. But she didn't make a sound. Just a completely vacant expression. We got to a mound at the edge of the clearing, where they'd made a makeshift shelter. They dug into the dirt and covered it with branches and moss. It was also a sort of storage, with at least a dozen different signs. Stop signs, bus stop signs, and even a couple of simple benches. This was some sort of tactic to catch people who were either on their own, lost, or desperate. They utilized anything they could to make a victim change their behavior. To stop for a moment. Or wait. The large one dropped a person next to me. An overweight, balding man in his late 20s, with some of the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. He was nodding in and out of consciousness, and I could see deep bruises on his neck. He must have been choked out. As our 5 attackers started going through their collection of signs and symbols, I tried to wake the other victim. He was completely out of it, muttering something about white doors and gardens. I couldn't make sense of it. When he finally came to, he could barely form a coherent sentence. My first thought was that he needed medical attention. He was clearly unwell. Still, he was coming to.
They got me at a red light,
he wheezed.
Pull me out of the car.
They got me at a bus stop. Had a fake sign.
Do they want money? I got money.
I don't think so. There was something deeply inhuman about these people. If they wanted money, they would have just killed me. No. They wanted something else. And it worried me. Before we got a chance to talk, they grabbed him by the foot and dragged him along the ground. The large woman didn't even flinch. This guy was easily 300 pounds, but she dragged him along like he was a bag of chips. He flailed and protested, the sleeve of his shirt getting stuck and pulled off on a sharp root. They all helped each other holding him down as he looked at me, calling for help. Those desperate, pale blue eyes. Never seen anything like them before. The large one took off her scarf, revealing a massive wound in the middle of her throat. It still looked red and fresh, a throat wound leading all the way into her esophagus. showing the contracting, raw musculature. That's where the whistling sound had come from. I could see it now. They weren't just taking shallow breaths. They were cycling their lungs. While one breathed in and out, the other did so at a different interval. Like when you pedal a bike. One foot goes down, one goes up. That's why the chest moves so much. They were constantly breathing. The whistling came from them inhaling and exhaling, seemingly simultaneously, and continuously. These weren't people. These were something different entirely. The large woman leaned in close, hugging her victim, putting their necks against one another. I had to do something. Anything. I grabbed the sharp root with the ripped-off shirt sleeve. I intended to use it as a weapon, swinging it wildly, but I couldn't get over the pain in my leg. There was no way I'd get away from them. They were fast, unharmed, and could do things that I just couldn't. So I just sat there with my root, watching the large woman undulate, with something large moving in and out of the wound in her throat, still with that expressionless face. I put all the things I knew together. They had displayed a kind of social structure. This was an alpha. They had tactics. They needed their victims alive for something. And all the people I was looking at were just people. There was no pattern, just broken, twisted people. So I had to try something. Anything. Using the torn-off sleeve, I tied it around my neck, using the blue sunflower pin to hold it together. It was a rudimentary scarf, in a way. Then I got up, and before the rest of them caught on, I walked up and stood next to my attacker. The man with the flannel shirt and yellow scarf. I tried to mimic their expressions. There was an immediate reaction. The man with the yellow scarf looked at me, then back at the others. They, in turn, just looked at the alpha. She leaned her head back, leaving the exposed wound in her victim open to the air. I could see something white moving in her throat, like a long, white tongue retracting into her chest. There was a moment of silence as she observed us. She seemed confused. I tried to blink seemingly at random, and take quick, shallow breaths. I could feel something wet on my throat. Apparently there was a little blood, probably from my hands. The alpha got up, her head bobbing back and forth. She hissed. There was a vibration as something rattled in her chest. My attacker seemed agitated, and he pushed me away. I fell over next to the signs, as the alpha stormed forward. First to discipline my attacker with a show of force, and then to inspect me. I grabbed a stop sign and got up, letting the adrenaline flow through me. I couldn't show pain. I just couldn't. Rapid breaths, blink at random, head on a swivel. I had to look like them, or this was doomed to fail. The alpha looked me over, making a rattling noise. She smelled the blood, poked at me, and presented her neck. I could see the wound just inches from my face, and all the way down her throat I saw something bone white, rattling back and forth like a stick in a barrel. She reached for my sleeve scarf, held together by that tiny pin. As her cold hands touched my neck, and her fingers started to bend into a grip, she suddenly stopped. The other victim was moving. I could have sworn he was dead, but he was moving now. A long, white, branch-like appendage was moving out of his open neck, reaching for the air. And for a moment, the group just looked at him. His body screamed. Not him as a person, but his body. A long, drawn-out shriek. A grown body crying like a newborn, blood still spurting from his open wound. They all gathered around him, but as my assailant stepped forward, the alpha hissed, causing him to retreat. Then, looking at me, it hissed again. It didn't like me, and it wanted me to leave. Both me and my assailant. Still holding the bus stop sign, I tried my best to confidently walk out of there. The sign had this heavy lead pipe that I could use to defend myself if need be. I got about 40 feet before I realized I was being followed. The man in the yellow scarf was coming for me, and he seemed angry. But this time I had a sturdier weapon. I tried to gain some ground to get away from the others. Whether they had been tricked by my antics or just didn't like me didn't matter. It was just me and this outcast. And as he charged me to wrestle me down, I was ready. This time, I swung my bus stop sign in an overhead arc, like I was chopping firewood. I closed my eyes, I held my breath, and hit him square in the chest. This was much more effective, and he doubled over. I just started beating him over and over, as his chest expanded and shrunk. As his scarf fell off, I could see something poking in and out of his neck wound. Something white, looking for an opportunity to escape. It pressed against his throat, making it bulge, like a snake throwing up an egg. I just kept beating him. I beat him until the white thing stopped moving, until I was covered in blood, until the shrieking died down, until the fingers stopped twitching in different directions, and until the head stopped swiveling back and forth. I beat him until my muscles burned, and my breathing turned rapid from exhaustion. When I finally wiped the sweat from my eyes, I was looking at nothing but broken bone and a yellow scarf. I barely remember making my way back to the main road. I remember collapsing as the sun rose, and a man in a white pickup calling for help. I remember a familiar face, a white door, something blue. Later on, my friend drove down from Morgantown to see me, and I got a dozen calls from friends and family asking if I was okay. They also had me take a drug test. Apparently, I'd acted irrationally. Just be careful. They can easily be identified. They wear something to cover their necks, and they travel one by one. They use something to get our attention and to separate us from others. Stop signs to catch lonely drivers. Bus stop signs to get drifters. They probably have a dozen other similar tactics. I think they're learning about us with secondhand information, testing and prodding to see what works. They don't talk, and they can be very patient. That first one stayed with me for a long time before he attacked. Maybe he was making sure I was alone. Looking back at it, I can barely even believe it happened. You ever have that one day that is just so different from anything else you've ever done? That one day that just feels like another life? Another time? That was one of those days. Sometimes I even managed to convince myself that it was all a lie. A nightmare. Something I cooked up in my sleep-deprived brain. But then I look at that blue sunflower pin. The one that held that sleeve together. And I know they're still out there. Alright, I hope you all enjoyed today's first story. Today's a double feature episode, and the second story is going to be read by another great YouTube horror narrator named Horror on the Rocks. So stay tuned for that coming up next. I hope you all will also check out their channel. I'll include a link in the description below. As well as please leave a comment, subscribe, and leave a like on this video if you can. Really helps out a lot. Alright, thanks everyone, and here comes the next episode.
As a kid, I was scared of pretty much everything. And at night, I'd see faces moving in the wallpaper. I'd see branches slither like snakes, piles of clothes turned to slumped bodies, lamps that looked like heads, and the front of cars that grinned at me with sinister intent. I could also hear them. A creaking door would sound like a groan. The wind would scream, and the floorboards would breathe heavy sighs. To me, there were ghouls, ghosts, and monsters around every corner. Needless to say, I was a nervous kid. Turns out it wasn't just an active imagination. I have a condition. It basically boils down to chronic overactive pareidolia. You know that thing where you can see faces in cars or shapes or people in trees? That's pareidolia. It is a sort of defense mechanism that humans have evolved to notice camouflaged creatures like jaguars and snakes, and to discern the sounds of encroaching predators. But to me, it is about 16 times more noticeable than what is normal for the average person. I see things everywhere, all of the time. Of course, there were treatments, and by age 12 I had tried 6 different regimens over a total of 4 years, and the side effects were brutal. Some would make me irritable, while others would make me hyper-focused. One type of medication just straight up put me to sleep. By age 18, I thought that I'd never get a job. I was barely dragging myself through school, and there was no way that I'd make it through college. I was on a course of drugs that barely kept me together, but they gave me these awful tics. I'd drop things, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my leg would shoot out and trip me. I was a mess. My mom had to cover the stairs and handrails in grip tape. A few years ago, I had a standing meeting with the County Employment Services every Thursday, and I hated it. On a particularly bad day, my mom had to drive me there. The meds were kicking my ass. She dropped me off at the end of the street, and just in that short walk to the office, I almost tripped into a brick wall. I was so flustered that I knocked over a trash can. But for the first time in a couple years, I had an interview with a potential employer. I didn't think much of her. She was just some old woman in a warm coat. She introduced herself as Teresa and told me that she'd heard a lot about me. She'd offered me a trial and a hefty one-time payment. I didn't get a clear idea of what I was supposed to do, but she told me that secrecy was part of it. The only demand that she had was that I stop taking my meds. Still feeling the trash smell on my pants, I took Teresa up on her offer. On my first day of work, I had no idea what to expect. I'd been off my meds for a week, and I had barely slept. It was hard to wrap my head around the world as I'd seen it as a kid. I'd see faces in the walls, and in the shadows, in the leaves, in patterns, and pretty much everywhere. I'd hear voices and screams in every braking car, in crinkling paper and creaking floors. It was hard staying focused, and I was so jumpy that I would barely move without flinching. Teresa picked me up in a gray sedan. She was wearing a headset and kept looking over at the GPS. I noticed that her leg was twitching, and that she kept biting her lip. She barely looked at me that whole ride. We finally arrived at a small yard, about a 40-minute drive off of the highway. There were 2 large trailers and a single-story rundown prefab house from the 60s. One of those things with cheap wood planks and matching broken windows. There were 8 other vehicles in the yard. 4 sedans, 2 vans, a Jeep, and a bus. They'd set up a warning tape, a command tent with laptops and an antenna, spotlights, and half a dozen crates covered with blue tarps. There were armed men with assault rifles, security personnel with handcuffs, and a couple medics standing by with first aid kits and stretchers. I was swarmed as soon as I stepped out of the car. They fitted me with a headset, protective gloves, a heart rate monitor, and tagged me with a plastic ribbon around my left wrist. All the while, Teresa was just looking around, a bead of sweat stinging from her eye. "What are we looking at?" she asked. 3, 4? "Just 1, I heard in the headset. "We got it early. You got the spot?" "On site," she responded. "Any blues?" "No blues. We're clear." And Teresa finally turned to me. She faced me and put her hands on my shoulders and talked very slowly. "This seems like a lot," she said. "All I want you to do is go inside, carefully, and tell me what you see." "Why?" I asked. "What's in there?" "I don't know," she sighed. "None of us knows. But we think that you can see it." "Is it dangerous?" She shook her head. "We don't know. We're trying to get to know them." There was a flurry of instructions. I had to sign a waiver, and they took pictures of me from 6 different angles and took several blood samples. They took a swab from my tongue, checked my eyes, and fitted me with a pair of safety goggles. Teresa took them from me just seconds later. "Nothing around your eyes," she said. "You need to see clearly." They asked me to approach the door while they were running some kind of diagnostic. Weapons checks, system checks, ready checks. It felt like we were launching a rocket, and I could feel my legs start to shake. "I'm with you all the way," Teresa said over the headset. "You can leave at any time. Just tell me what you see, and I really mean what you see." And a countdown began. And at 0, the spotlights turned on, and the entire yard turned into a soundless ghost town. And everyone held their breath. And it was my turn. I stepped inside. A simple one-story house, 3 rooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen. Someone had clearly lived there until recently. There were still clothes flung over the chair in the living room. The power was off, but the pale spotlights coming through the windows made it feel like I was walking through a hospital waiting room. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't know what to expect, but this payday could be the boost that I needed to get my own place. A paycheck with 4 zeros for a single day of work. But standing there, looking into the sterile living room, I was having doubts. "What do you see?" asked Teresa. "Notice anything?" "No, just furniture. A couch, an old TV, a fancy carpet. Nothing out of the ordinary. I just walked around, saying out loud what I was seeing. And as the minutes passed by, Teresa was getting impatient. "These are just things," she said. "I need you to tell me what you really see." I entered the bathroom and immediately felt this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. A noise tickled my ear, and I looked in the bathroom mirror. I could see something moving behind it. And in a heartbeat, I caught a glimpse of a pair of blue eyes. And I turned around, screaming, Something moved! I flung myself backwards, closing the bathroom door with the tip of my fingers. I stumbled, tearing down the shower curtain and crushing a cockroach. Laying there with my feet in the air, I tried to remember to breathe. Rarely have I ever been so scared that I had to remind myself to breathe. My fingers, they tingled with adrenaline. "Tell me what you saw," Teresa yelled. "What's in there?" Blue eyes. It had blue eyes." "Did you see where it went?" I didn't. And to the best of my knowledge, it was still outside the door. "Look again," she continued. "Look again and then get out." She had to coax me out of the bathtub, to encourage me, spurred me on, and reminded me that I had to leave the room one way or the other. It probably took them 15 minutes to get me out of the tub, and when they did, I could barely feel my feet. And when I finally opened the bathroom door, I couldn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. I carefully stepped out, looking around. Nothing. Standing in the middle of the living room, I felt like an idiot. This was exactly what I was taking my medication for: paranoia and sudden bouts of fear. And it dawned on me that maybe I was influenced by the people outside and their preparations. I was walking in here expecting to see something. They'd worked me up, so of course I was seeing things. But then again, there was an odd painting on the wall that I hadn't paid attention to earlier. It was the strangest thing. It was a sort of thrift store painting showing 2 women walking across a bridge on a hot summer day. It was sort of generic, but I'd been hyper-vigilant when I first stepped in. You know that feeling when you say a word over and over so many times that it starts sounding like a noise? That's the feeling that fell over my eyes. The picture started to blur and disappear, turning into swirling colors. And there, in that blur, I saw those blue eyes. There were small blue spots in the water, on the sides of the bridge, in the painting. That's what I'd seen, and there I'd seen a face. Something blending into my sight and disappearing. And for a second, I knew for certain that I hadn't seen this painting when I first stepped inside, and now it knew that I could see it. I felt it. I slowly started to back out. "There's something in the painting," I whispered. "In the living room." "You sure?" Teresa asked. "Absolutely sure." "Absolutely." "Get out." I rounded the corner and I heard the floorboards creak. I could no longer see the painting, and I could sense something moving, backing out of the front door and into the cool autumn air. I could feel hands on my shoulders. Armed men pulled me back. The paramedics started to check my eyes with flashlights. They asked me all sorts of personal questions, like my name, my mother's maiden name, and the name of the president, and I was told to lie down. And as I heard, a team breached the house with stun guns, cattle prods, nets, and a crate. Laying there and feeling the pressure subside, I just cried and laughed. I didn't even notice Teresa sitting down next to me. I was given a cold drink and a pill, and I took it without question. "You did good," she said. "You're done. You're done." What was that? What is in there? Something only a special mind can see. And that was my first time working with Teresa. Over the coming years, I would be called in about once or twice a month, and the pay I got for those few days was enough to get me out of my parents' house. Teresa would check in with me weekly, and I had to submit to regular checkups, but more often than not, I was completely off the leash. I started to learn a little bit more about the company that I was working for and what they were doing. I started getting payments from Hatchet Biotechnica, a subsidiary of Hatchet Pharmaceuticals. My official title was contractor, a title that was repeated like a name. Teresa started going into greater details on what to look for and how to act. But that first mission was a sort of test to prove myself. I had no idea what I was actually proving, but I felt like my tendency to discern patterns and seeing dangers helped me along. I learned a bit more about their procedures. For example, that they were adamant about checking for the blues. This meant surveying the nearby area to look for some kind of infection, usually taking the form of multicolored flowers. Most often blue, but not always. And sometimes tulips, but most often sunflowers. And once they found a bunch of teeth sticking out of the wall, whenever they checked for the blues, this is what they looked for. Something overtly strange and unnatural. And when something like this was found, the whole mission would be called off, and they would use controlled explosive to take out the entire area. In more populated areas, they'd set up tents and use flamethrowers. I remember once, the week before Christmas, when 6 men with flamethrowers were called in to burn down a greenhouse. I'll never forget the way that the flames reflected off their visors. To them, it all just looked like flames, but I saw something. I saw bodies, writhing in the flames. I heard screams in the shattered glass. And in the charred remains of melted plastic, I'd see pained faces glaring at me with hateful black eyes. And up until a few months ago, I had worked a total of 33 cases over 2.5 years. Every case, I'd step into a location and look for more than 3 things, hiding in plain sight. Up until that point, I still had no idea what they actually were. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something running past me, or I'd see a pair of blue eyes looking at me from across the room. And every time, I just reported it and left. A chair, a fridge, a suspicious window. Hell, once it was a music box. And this time, we were just coming to a house. It was a rainy autumn evening, and the area was already set up when we got there. I saw a for sale sign knocked over by one of the Jeeps who'd taken a wide turn. I got suited up, blood samples, plastic wrap, and all that jazz. It was set up to just be another job. Although I was still nervous, I was getting better. "No blues?" asked Teresa. "None," said one of the armed men. "We're looking at a single tango." "You sure?" Teresa squinted. "First report said 6.
Secondary reading says 1. We might have runners."
Notify the Galapagos, she sighed. Put him on the hunt. She turned to me with a smile, tapping me on the shoulder. In and out. You got this. Yeah, I got this, I repeated. Yeah. Standard routine. Countdown, spotlights, game on. It felt like stepping onto a stage. And as I walked through the door and saw my shadow stretch across the floor, I felt like a hunter. That I was the one to fear, and that whatever stayed in the house tried to hide for good reason. The floor is crooked, I noted. Strange place. You sure? Yeah, I nodded. Definitely. I steadied myself and I started checking the rooms one by one. I waited for that feeling to emerge, my eyes seeing through the obvious and seeing the pictures beneath the picture. The blue eyes emerged from nothing, and the patterns of shadowy figures growing clearer. Just relaxing and expecting that feeling to wash over me was enough to put me at ease. But I could still feel a primal part of me tickling my nerves, expecting me to panic. But nothing happened. I checked the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom. There was nothing. Just a strangely crooked floor and empty rooms and the echo of my own footsteps. An empty guest bedroom with a single window. And through it, I imagined scowling faces in the trees outside. 20 minutes passed, and I got nothing. I reported to Teresa, and she assured me that we were still getting readings from inside the house. Something was still in there with me, but I hadn't seen anything. I went through cycles of denial, fear, and anger over and over. What was I missing? And finally, I just sat down in the middle of the living room floor. I scratched my eyes, sighed, and tried to relax. Teresa, I'm not feeling it. Are you sure? And there was no response. Teresa. Yeah, she responded absent-mindedly. Yeah, no, we're good. Hold on for a minute. We're good? I asked. What do you mean, we're good? And again, no response. I stomped around for another 10 minutes before I went up to the window facing the front yard. It was hard to see through the glare of the spotlight. Teresa, I'm coming out. This place is empty. And as soon as I opened the front door, I saw 24 faces fixed on me. Maybe they were surprised to see me, but I got the sense that there was something else. I could tell that something was off. They all looked at me with strange expressions, some neutral and some smiling ear to ear. One of the paramedics just stared at me with slack-jawed terror. It was as if they didn't know what to feel or how to express it. And a hole sunk through my stomach. I got that hollow feeling as my eyes glazed over, like I was staring at something false, something hiding a pattern. This was the sense that I'd been looking for inside. And now I was feeling it. And in the far back, I saw Teresa. She stepped out from behind a Jeep, smiling ear to ear. And behind the shape of her face, her eyes emerged, glowing with a cold blue. And one by one, their eyes flared up in a blue glow. And there, in a moment, my paranoid sight registered human-like shapes in the grass around them. Headless, mauled bodies. Imposters, lookalikes, mimics, nightmare beings having tricked us into a trap. And one by one, smiles started creeping across their faces, rows of impossibly sharp teeth hiding long tongues, their fingers growing longer, their necks elongating. They were losing their disguises and facing me, head-on and unafraid. Nothing was said out loud. Not a word. But to me, it was as if the wind itself was screaming for me to run. I slammed the door behind me and I ran. Faces were coming out of the walls, door handles turning into hands grasping at my clothes, my distorted face reflecting in windows and mirrors with jawless grins. I couldn't blink. Every heartbeat, a new horror forced my eyes open. There were more doors than I remembered. There were more windows than there should be. The kitchen suddenly had a skylight, and there were 4 fridges. Countless paintings had appeared in the master bedroom, depicting cruel and blood-drenched horrors. They were already here, trying to surround me, and my mind was racing to remember what was real and what wasn't. Rushing to the back of the guest room, I remembered there being only 1 window, but now there were 2. I had to roll the dice, take a guess, do something. As I grabbed the window frame, I imagined teeth slamming into my hands, tongues licking across my palms, wide smiles satiating their hunger. But this time, it was just my imagination. I burst through the window and took off running into the woods. And through the night, I just kept going. My chest hurt from holding in the screams. And without my medication, everything in the dark looked like something reaching for me, trying to eat me and trying to grab me. Creaking branches sounded like laughter, and the howling winds were screams. I must have run for hours when my foot got caught between 2 rocks, and as I tumbled to the ground, twisting my ankle, I saw them descend on me. I felt their fingers scratching me. I writhed on the ground, screaming for them to just let me go, to just please, please, let me go! But after a few seconds, I realized that I had just scratched myself on the underbrush. There was no one there. I was safe. I broke down crying, trying to ignore the twisted face reflecting off of the full moon above. Eventually, I made my way home. There were no messages waiting for me. All my work numbers had been taken offline. All ways to contact them were gone. And there was no info on the firm that hired me. Hatchet Biotechnica exists only on paper. There's no location, there's no contact info, and there's no names attached. It's all a front. I haven't heard from Teresa since. I think that whoever I've been working for just assumes that I'm dead. So that's why I decided to share this anonymously. Those who know who I am can reach out to me. And for those who don't, just have a word of warning. Be observant and trust your intuition. It might just save your life.
Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGroupeHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward. And if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.